The city streets were quiet that night, except for the distant hum of traffic and the occasional chatter of pedestrians passing by. Streetlights flickered, casting long shadows along the sidewalk where an elderly blind man slowly made his way home. His name was Elijah Kane. Dressed in a simple, worn-out coat and holding a sturdy cane, he walked with the steady confidence of a man who had spent years navigating the world without sight. To most people, he was just another old man, helpless, vulnerable. But what they didn't know was that Elijah wasn't just any blind man. He was a legend, a ghost from a past few could even begin to understand. A former Navy SEAL, the best of the best. A man whose name was whispered with respect among soldiers, yet forgotten by the world he once served. And perhaps that was exactly how he wanted it. On this particular night, Elijah was on his usual route home from the small bookstore he liked to visit. He enjoyed the smell of old pages, the faint sounds of life around him, the comforting rhythm of a world he could feel but not see. But as he turned down a quieter street, something changed. The air felt different, tense. His instincts, the ones honed from years of combat, screamed at him. Someone was watching. Then, voices. "Hey, old man, you lost?" A rough voice called out, laced with mockery. Elijah didn't stop walking. He had dealt with punks like this before, kids looking for trouble, trying to get a reaction. Usually, if he ignored them, they got bored and moved on. But not tonight. Footsteps followed, more than one pair. He counted at least 3, maybe 4. "I'm talking to you," another voice said, this one closer. The sound of shoes scuffing against pavement told Elijah that the man had stepped right into his path. He stopped, his grip tightening just slightly on his cane. "I'm just passing through," Elijah said calmly, his voice steady. He had no interest in a confrontation. Not because he was afraid, but because he knew exactly how it would end. But these men weren't looking for peace. "Oh, look at that," the first voice sneered. "Blind and polite. That's real cute." Then came the shove. It wasn't hard, just enough to test him, to see if he'd stumble. Elijah took a controlled step back, steadying himself. He could hear their laughter, the kind that was meant to humiliate. They thought he was weak, defenseless, an easy target. He sighed, tilting his head slightly, listening. He could hear their breathing, the way they shifted their weight, the faint clinking of something metallic, keys, a chain. One of them was fidgeting with something in his pocket. Maybe a knife, maybe just nervous hands. Either way, it didn't matter. "Look, fellas," Elijah said, his tone still even controlled. "You don't want to do this." That only made them laugh harder. "Oh yeah," one of them mocked. "And why's that?" Elijah's grip tightened around his cane, though not for balance. He didn't need it to stand. "Because," he said, his voice dropping just slightly, "you have no idea who you're messing with." For the first time there was hesitation. It was brief, but Elijah felt it. A flicker of uncertainty. But then arrogance took over. The leader of the group stepped forward again, shoving Elijah harder this time, making him stumble slightly. "What's the old man gonna do, huh?" The thugs sneered. "Call the cops. Cry for help." Elijah exhaled slowly. He had given them a chance. More than one, but they didn't take it. He straightened, shifting his stance just slightly, the kind of movement no ordinary blind man would make. It was subtle, but if they had been paying attention, they would have noticed something was off. The way he planted his feet, the way his shoulders squared. This wasn't the posture of a helpless man. This was something else. Something dangerous. The street light above flickered again, casting a brief shadow across Elijah's face. He turned his head slightly, listening, calculating. He had fought in wars, taken down trained assassins, survived missions no man was supposed to come back from. And yet, here he was, facing a group of young punks who had no idea they were seconds away from making the worst mistake of their lives. The air was heavy with tension. Then one of them moved. And in that instant, everything changed. The moment the first thug moved, Elijah heard it. The sharp intake of breath, The shift in weight, the subtle creak of a shoe against concrete. It was all he needed. Time slowed in his mind, just like it always did in moments like these. He had been trained to sense the attack before it came, to anticipate movement before his opponent even realized what they were about to do. A fist came swinging toward him, wild and undisciplined. Elijah didn't flinch. Instead, he stepped to the side with precise control, letting the momentum of the attacker carry him forward. The thug stumbled, confused for a split second, before regaining his footing. His friends laughed, but there was hesitation in their voices now. Elijah turned his head slightly, listening, tracking them. "Did he just dodge that?" one of them muttered. "He got lucky," another said. "He can't even see." But luck had nothing to do with it. Elijah remained calm, standing in the same spot. He knew what was coming next. They wouldn't walk away now, not after looking weak in front of each other. They had to prove something, and that was the problem with men like them. They relied on fear, on power in numbers, on the idea that their target wouldn't fight back. But Elijah Kane had never been that kind of man. The second attack came quicker, more aggressive. A different set of footsteps rushed toward him, the sound of fabric shifting, the telltale rush of air that told him a punch was flying straight for his ribs. Elijah turned his body just enough to avoid it, stepping back, letting the strike miss by inches. The thug overextended, his balance momentarily thrown off. Elijah could have ended it right then, could have struck in a way that would leave the man on the ground, gasping for air. But he didn't, not yet. Instead, he exhaled and waited. The frustration in the group was growing now. They thought this would be easy. They had expected a frail old man, an easy target, not someone who moved like a shadow, who avoided their attacks without effort. "This guy's messing with us," one of them snapped. The leader stepped forward now, his voice full of irritation. "You think this is funny, old man?" Elijah tilted his head slightly, as if considering the question. Then, in a quiet voice, he said, "I think you should go home." The laughter was gone now. A tense silence filled the air. Even the distant sounds of the city seemed muffled, as if the world itself had paused to see what would happen next. Then the leader growled, "Get him." Elijah heard them move all at once. No more playing around. They had made up their minds. They were going to beat him down. But they had no idea what they had just walked into. Before the first thug could lay a hand on him, Elijah moved. He sidestepped the nearest attacker, twisting his cane in his grip. In one swift motion, he hooked it behind the man's knee and pulled. The thug's leg buckled, and he crashed onto the pavement with a startled shout. The second one lunged, but Elijah was already moving again. He shifted his weight, ducking under a clumsy punch, and let the attacker stumble forward. With a simple nudge to the back, the thug went sprawling, nearly colliding with his fallen friend. The others hesitated. For the first time they felt it, that cold grip of uncertainty. Something was wrong. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. The blind man was supposed to be weak, helpless, but he wasn't. He was something else entirely. One of them finally spoke, his voice quieter now. Who are you?" Elijah didn't answer. He simply stood there, waiting, his grit on the cane firm but relaxed. Memories stirred in his mind, memories of another time, another battlefield. He hadn't always been a quiet man walking the streets of the city. Once, and he had been a warrior, a leader, a man who walked in the darkest corners of the world and came back alive when no one else did. He had fought in wars that were never spoken of, taken down enemies that most people didn't even know existed. And then one day, he had walked away from it all, not because he was tired, not because he was broken, but because he had given enough of his life to the fight. Losing his sight had only solidified his decision. It was an injury that should have ended everything, should have made him weak, but it hadn't. Instead, it had sharpened everything else: his hearing, his instincts, his ability to read the world in ways that sighted people never could. And now, in a quiet alley, Against men who thought they owned the night, those instincts had woken up once more. The leader of the group took a step back, his confidence cracking. Elijah turned his head toward him. He could hear the way the man's breathing had changed, the slight tremor in his voice when he spoke again. You're not just some blind guy, are you?" Elijah didn't answer right away. He let the silence stretch, let the weight of their mistake settle in. Then, in a voice as steady as stone, he said, "Go home." For a moment, no one moved. Then, one of the younger thugs, probably the least experienced, made a decision. He pulled something from his pocket, a knife. The quiet snick of the blade flicking open was unmistakable. Elijah sighed. He had hoped they were smarter than this, but it seemed they weren't. And that meant things were about to get much worse for them. The knife glinted in the dim light, its blade catching the faint glow of the street lamp. The thug holding it wasn't thinking clearly. Fear was clouding his judgment. He didn't know who he was dealing with. None of them did. Elijah could hear the shallow breaths of the man, the slight tremor in his hands as he gripped the weapon. He could hear the others, too, the way their feet shuffled uneasily on the pavement, the way they were too afraid to act. They were beginning to realize that this wasn't just a confrontation with a helpless old man. They had bitten off more than they could chew. "Put the knife down," Elijah said, his voice steady but carrying an edge of warning. The thug with the knife took a step closer, his eyes darting nervously from his friends to Elijah. "You think I'm scared of you, old man," he spat. Elijah didn't flinch. He had seen much worse in his time. People who had no idea what fear really was. These boys weren't killers. They were just angry, confused, and out of their depth. But anger, Elijah knew, made people dangerous. It clouded their vision, made them unpredictable. He couldn't afford to let them get too reckless. With a soft exhale, Elijah adjusted his stance. He wasn't going to make the first move, not unless they forced his hand. His experience told him that the best way to deal with fear was to let it fester, let it grow. And grow it did. The thug with the knife was now within arm's reach, and Elijah could feel the heat of the weapon in the air, smell the sharp tang of sweat and adrenaline. The others were watching, waiting for their moment, but none of them made a move. They weren't sure what to do next. Then the thug lunged. It was quick, but it wasn't clean. The knife came down, slicing through the air, but Elijah was already moving. He sidestepped with the fluidity of someone who had done this thousands of times. The thug's momentum carried him forward, and before he could right himself, Elijah's cane was there, twisting, pulling, jabbing at the thug's wrist. The knife dropped to the ground with a metallic asterisk clink asterisk. The thug cried out in pain, clutching his wrist, but Elijah wasn't done. In one smooth motion, he stepped behind the man, grabbing him by the shoulder and twisting him down onto the pavement, using the thug's own momentum against him. The others froze, their mouths open in disbelief. The first thug was on the ground, disarmed and incapacitated, and Elijah hadn't even broken a sweat. "Get up," Elijah said, his voice cold and firm. The thug struggled, but Elijah didn't give him a chance to recover. He kept him pinned, his knee pressing into the man's back, his grip on his arm unyielding. Elijah had lived through too many battles to waste energy on unnecessary moves. This wasn't about proving something. This was about survival. His survival. "Who's next?" Elijah asked, not even bothering to look at the others. The remaining thugs glanced at one another, their fear now evident. They had made a critical mistake, one they were beginning to regret, but there was no turning back. The leader, who had been quiet up until now, clenched his fists. The others seemed to be waiting for him to make a move, but the hesitation was growing too strong. He could see that his friends weren't ready to go any further. They were already second-guessing their decision to pick on a man they now realized they couldn't control. But the leader couldn't back down. Not now. His pride wouldn't let him. He stepped forward, trying to muster the courage that had fueled him moments ago. His voice shook as he said, "Get off him. Now." Elijah didn't respond. The leader came at him then, trying to catch him by surprise with a wild swing. But it was too easy for Elijah. He could read the man's every movement, the way his body tensed before the strike, the slight shift in his feet as he overcommitted. Elijah ducked under the punch and swung his cane up, catching the man in the stomach, pushing the air from his lungs. The leader staggered back, gasping for breath, his eyes wide with shock. He had thought he could overpower Elijah, but now he was the one on the defensive. "Do you want to keep going?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but laced with finality. The leader looked at him, his face flushed with anger and fear. But there was something else in his eyes, a flicker of recognition. Elijah's calmness was unsettling. There was something about this man, about the way he moved, the way he controlled the situation, that didn't fit the image of a blind old man. For a moment, the leader hesitated. His mind raced, trying to piece together what was happening, but the pieces didn't fit. He looked to his friends, seeking reassurance, but found none. One of the younger thugs, who had been silent the entire time, finally spoke up, his voice trembling. "I think we should just go. This guy's not normal." The leader shot him a sharp look, but the doubt was creeping in. His grit on his pride was slipping. "You heard him," the younger thug insisted. "Let's go before we get hurt." But it was too late. The tension in the air was thick, suffocating. The fight was already over, but they didn't know it yet. They were caught in the web Elijah had spun around them, and they couldn't escape. Elijah stepped back slowly, giving the leader a moment to make his decision. The group had already lost. They knew it. But would they walk away with their pride intact, or would they press forward and risk further humiliation? It wasn't about the fight anymore. It wasn't about who was tougher or who could win. It was about the power of choice. The choice they now had to make: back down and walk away or risk losing everything. The silence stretched on, punctuated only by the distant sounds of the city. Elijah's grip on his cane tightened, but he didn't move. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't even angry. He had seen it all before. And then, in a moment that seemed to last forever, the leader made his decision. "We're done," he muttered. The group of thugs, beaten and broken in spirit, turned without another word and fled into the night, leaving Elijah standing alone in the street. He didn't watch them go. There was no need. He already knew how this story would end for them. But as they disappeared into the shadows, Elijah's mind wandered. He hadn't asked for this. He hadn't asked for his past to come back and haunt him. He hadn't asked to be pulled back into a world he had left behind long ago. And yet, here he was. A blind man, walking alone in a city that had forgotten his name, except it hadn't really forgotten. It had just never known. The weight of it all pressed down on him. He could hear their footsteps fading, but his own thoughts were growing louder. And somewhere deep inside him, something shifted. The past had never been as far behind as he had wanted to believe. The night had grown still after the thugs disappeared into the darkness, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. It wasn't just the adrenaline of the fight that kept his senses sharp. It was something deeper, a gut instinct that something else was coming. He could feel it in the pit of his stomach, like a storm brewing in the distance. His cane tapped lightly against the pavement as he continued his walk, but the usual rhythm felt off, too quiet, too empty. The city around him seemed to have swallowed up every sound. His senses were alert, sharper than ever, but the streets felt foreign, colder than they should have been. The weight of the night seemed to press in from all sides. Elijah knew better than to believe the danger was over. It had never been over. The thugs were just the beginning. He had seen it before, a brush with violence that quickly escalated, a momentary respite before a far darker storm gathered force. And it wasn't just them. It was something else. Something older. Something tied to his past that he had tried so desperately to forget. The familiar hum of the city was suddenly interrupted by the sharp sound of a car's engine revving. Elijah paused. His mind raced. He had lived in this neighborhood for years. The streets were usually quiet at this hour, save for the occasional passing car. But this was different. There was something off about the way the engine rolled to life, the sound of tires skidding, turning, almost like someone was circling him. He slowed his pace, listening more carefully. The car's headlights swept across the street in a flash of white light, cutting through the shadows. Elijah instinctively turned toward it, his hand on his cane. He knew he was being watched. He had been for a while now. The thugs weren't the first to take an interest in him, and they wouldn't be the last. But who was in the car? Who was watching him now? His breath caught in his throat when the car slowed to a stop just a few feet away. He didn't move, but his senses were on high alert. The hair on the back of his neck stood up, an old, familiar feeling creeping up his spine. The door to the car swung open. Elijah could hear the faint rustle of clothing, the quiet steps of someone approaching. There was no rush, no panic in the way they moved. Whoever they were in control. And that was what made his skin crawl. "You're still alive, Cain," a voice called out from the shadows, rough, familiar. Elijah's grip on his cane tightened. He hadn't heard that name in years. Cain. The past rushed back like a flood. He had left that life behind. He had buried it. But now it was back, and it wasn't going to let him go that easily. He tilted his head slightly, letting his hearing take over. The footsteps were slow, measured. Whoever it was wasn't rushing to fight. They were toying with him, testing him. A familiar tactic. Elijah's mind flashed back to the old days, the missions, the enemies he had faced, the way they had always used fear as a weapon. But this was different. He wasn't in uniform anymore. He was just an old man, alone on a dark street. Yet the tension in the air told him this wasn't just any encounter. This was something deeper. And whoever was coming for him was no stranger. "You've been out of the game too long, Elijah," the voice continued. "You've forgotten how this works." There was a sickening chuckle, like they were enjoying this, enjoying the way the old man was reacting. "We're just getting started." Elijah's heart began to pound in his chest, but he didn't let it show. He had fought wars. He had survived through hell and back. He wasn't about to let some shadow from his past dictate the terms. But that voice, that asterisk voice, he couldn't ignore it. His instincts were screaming at him. This wasn't random. This wasn't just some thug trying to prove a point. This was personal. "Who sent you?" Elijah asked, his voice calm, but firm, like a soldier interrogating an enemy who thought they had the upper hand. His fingers tightened around his cane as he tried to pick up any other sounds that might give him a clue, but it was silent now. The street felt too still. The figure stepped closer, just out of reach, but close enough to feel the weight of their presence. Elijah could hear the rustle of clothing again, the slight shift in posture, and he knew. Whoever it was, they were dangerous. He could sense the tension in the air, the weight of their intent. They weren't here to talk. The voice laughed again, and the sound sent a chill through Elijah's body. "You really think I'm going to tell you that?" The figure took another step forward. "You've been living in the dark for too long, Elijah. You really think you can walk away from who you used to be?" Elijah's mind raced. He had walked away, yes, but he had never truly left. The people he had crossed paths with, the enemies he had made, they didn't forget. And now, it seemed, they had found him again. They had come to settle an old score. "Why now?" Elijah asked, his voice lower, more intense. "After all these years." The figure's footsteps stopped. A silence followed, heavy and thick, as though the answer was on the tip of their tongue. Then finally, the voice spoke, softer this time, almost as if to himself. "Because you're the only one who got away." Elijah's mind clicked into place. He knew now. This wasn't just a random encounter. This wasn't some isolated event. The past had been hunting him, waiting for the moment when it could finally catch up. The people he had once fought with, had all moved on. But there were always those left behind. The ones who remembered what they had done, the ones who couldn't forget. "You think I'm still the same man I was?" Elijah asked, his voice sharp now, his body tense. "You think I haven't changed?" "I think you're still dangerous," the voice said. And there it was again, the fear. It was there, buried beneath the bravado, the cocky tone of the figure's voice. They had come here to fight, to challenge him, but deep down they were afraid. They knew Elijah could still take them down if they weren't careful, and they didn't want to find out what would happen if they pushed him too far. Elijah took a slow step forward, his senses honed to perfection. He didn't need to see this person to know what they were capable of. He didn't need to see them at all. He had survived without his sight for a reason. He had learned to read the smallest of details, the shift in the air, the tension in a person's breath. He knew how to use those things to his advantage, and right now he could feel it. The moment was coming. The choice was in his hands. The figure didn't move, but Elijah could hear them inhale sharply, preparing for whatever was about to happen. The air was thick with anticipation. Whoever they were ready for a fight. But Elijah wasn't sure he was ready to fight back yet. Not until he knew who they were working for. Not until he understood the full picture of the past that had suddenly dragged him back into its grip. The silence stretched on, stretching every moment, every breath. And just when it seemed like the world had paused, Elijah moved. Elijah's hand gripped his cane, the tension in his fingers steady, but the anticipation in his chest was like a coil, tightening with every passing second. He could feel the figure's presence in front of him, their breath shallow, but there was something else now. Something in the air had changed. Just when he thought the moment couldn't get any more charged, the sound of a second car, faint but unmistakable, drew his attention. It wasn't the same as the first. This one was closer, moving faster. He could hear the heavy thrum of the engine accelerating, the tires screeching slightly against the pavement. The rhythm of the sounds was deliberate, controlled. It was like they knew exactly what they were doing. The figure in front of him didn't seem to notice, but Elijah's instincts were sharp. He wasn't going to be caught off guard. He wasn't the one who had made a mistake this time. He could feel it. The second car wasn't a coincidence. The other was a distraction. Before Elijah could process what was happening, a shadow lunged from his right. He didn't have time to react. A figure, tall and quick, slammed into him with force that took him off balance. His cane flew from his hand, clattering to the pavement as the assailant pinned him to the ground. A knee pressed hard against his chest, cutting off his breath. "Don't move," a voice barked, just as cold as the first. The panic of a struggle set in, but Elijah wasn't one to panic. He had faced worse in his life, far worse. He twisted his body with a fluid motion, grabbing the arm of his attacker with one hand, forcing the other to release its grip on his chest. The brief shift in the assailant's posture gave Elijah just enough leverage to push the man away. The figure stumbled back, but not before Elijah could grab the knife the man had been holding. In one swift motion he turned, the blade glinting in the moonlight. But before Elijah could make his next move, a gunshot rang out, sharp, piercing the night air. The sound was deafening. The bullet whizzed past his ear, so close he could feel the wind of its passing, and struck the wall behind him with a violent third asterisk. The force sent a shudder through his spine. Everything stopped. For a brief second, the world felt suspended in time. His mind was racing, trying to piece together the puzzle. There had to be something he was missing. Why was there a second car? Why were they using guns now? Was this all connected? And then the bombshell dropped. A voice came from behind him, but this time, it wasn't the person he had been facing. It was an entirely new voice, smoother, colder. "I thought you'd recognize me, Elijah." The voice was unmistakable, familiar, haunting. "You never did learn how to stay out of trouble." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. The name wasn't spoken, but it didn't have to be. Elijah knew who it was. His mind went numb, racing through every possible scenario, trying to understand how it was possible. He should have known. He should have known better. This wasn't just some random enemy from his past. This was someone who had been watching him for far longer than he could have imagined. The figure behind him stepped forward, and Elijah recognized a sound of their boots scraping the pavement. He didn't need to see their face to know who it was. This person was a ghost from his past, someone he thought was long gone. "How long have you been watching me?" Elijah asked, his voice steady despite the storm of emotions whirling inside him. He didn't have to turn around. He could already feel the presence of the man who had hunted him all these years. "Long enough to know you were bound to slip up eventually," the man said, his voice laced with a sickening calmness. Elijah's mind flashed back, years ago, when he thought he had finally left his past behind. He had walked away from everything: the Navy, the missions, the bloodshed. He had earned his peace, or at least he had tried to. But peace, it seemed, had never been meant for him. The man in front of him wasn't just anyone. This was a former ally, a comrade from a time when Elijah had been deep in the shadows. They had fought together, trusted each other. But there had always been something off about him, something dangerous Elijah had chosen to ignore back then. Now, standing face to face with the reality of it all, Elijah realized he had made a deadly mistake. "You really think you can leave all of that behind, Elijah?" The man taunted, his steps drawing closer, filling the air with a thick tension. "You think you can just forget the people you've crossed, the lives you've taken?" Elijah's breath quickened, but his hands remained steady. He didn't have time to process the overwhelming sense of betrayal that was flooding his chest. He needed to think, to act. He couldn't let this man take control. Not now. The car had stopped just behind them, and Elijah knew it wasn't just an accident. This wasn't a chance encounter. This was planned. The figure in front of him wasn't the mastermind. No, this was the muscle, the one sent to finish the job. But the one behind him, the one who spoke in that cold, calculating voice, that was the one who had been orchestrating everything from the start. "You should have stayed retired, Cain. That's what everyone else did." The man's tone was mocking now, as if Elijah had made some naive, foolish mistake. But Elijah wasn't naive. He had just been in hiding. Hiding from a war that had never ended. And now the war had come back for him. And it was bigger than just a few thugs on the street. It was bigger than just the enemies he had known. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about exposure, about someone wanting to bring the ghosts of his past back to life, to drag him back into the darkness he had fought so hard to escape. The figure with the knife took another step forward, but before Elijah could react, another shot rang out. This time, it wasn't a warning. The bullet struck the ground near Elijah's feet, and the world around him seemed to explode into chaos. The air was thick with tension, the stakes higher than ever, and Elijah could feel the weight of it all pressing down on him. Every part of him screamed to fight back, to act, but the second car was just a small part of the puzzle, and whoever was pulling the strings had a plan that went far deeper than a street fight. He was a piece in a much larger game, and the realization hit him like a freight train. The question now wasn't just how to survive the night. It was how to uncover the truth of what was really going on, and if he could, at all, stop it before it was too late. The storm had arrived, and Elijah was standing in the eye of it. The world seemed to hold its breath as Elijah stood in the midst of chaos, surrounded by enemies who had come to reclaim him. The gunshot had barely registered before the pressure of the night crashed down on him, but in the midst of it all, something inside of him clicked. The past, the ghosts that had haunted him for years, were finally converging. His muscles tensed as he prepared to move, but he knew one thing for sure: there was no turning back now. The figure in front of him, the one who had orchestrated everything, was still speaking, his voice dripping with disdain. "You never learned, did you? You never learned that once you're in for life. There's no leaving, Elijah. Not when the stakes are this high." But Elijah wasn't listening anymore. He was already moving, his body reacting instinctively, his senses honed by years of training. In a fluid motion, he lunged toward the man who had been closest to him. His fist connected with the attacker's jaw in a clean, decisive strike, sending the man stumbling back. Elijah's vision was obscured, but his senses, the ones that had carried him through countless dangerous missions, were sharper than ever. The second man, the one with the gun, seemed to hesitate. Elijah had never liked guns, never trusted them in the heat of a real fight. It was too easy for an opponent to hide behind a trigger. But right now, the hesitation was his ally. Elijah spun around and used his momentum to disarm the man in a blur of motion, forcing the gun from his hand with a twist of his wrist. The weapon clattered to the ground, just as a third man emerged from the shadows, moving faster than Elijah expected. Before he could react, the man lunged at him with a brutal grip, attempting to choke him from behind. But Elijah had been in worse situations. He shifted his body, using his opponent's momentum against him, and threw the man to the ground with a devastating crash. The thud of the man's body hitting the pavement echoed through the still night, but Elijah wasn't done. His mind was focused, and his body moved with precision, his every action dictated by years of combat training. It was over in moments. The three men lay motionless on the ground, and the street was eerily silent again, save for Elijah's steady breath. He took a moment to catch his breath, wiping the sweat from his forehead, his heart racing. His hands were trembling, but it wasn't from fear. It was from the adrenaline, from the raw intensity of the fight. But there was still no sign of the man behind him, the one who had masterminded everything. Elijah turned slowly, his senses alert, and then he heard it. The soft click of a gun's safety being released. It came from behind him, just out of reach, but he didn't need to see it. He could hear it. He could feel the presence of the man who had been watching him from the shadows. "Not bad for a blind man," came the voice, low and smug. "But it's over now. You didn't think you could escape forever, did you?" Elijah froze. He wasn't afraid. He wasn't panicking. But the reality of the situation was sinking in. This was the moment. This was the climax he had been working toward. He had taken down the muscle, the guns, the chaos. But the man behind it all was still there, pulling the strings. "You've been running, Cain," the voice continued, a sick smile evident in his tone. "And now it's time for the final piece of the puzzle." The sound of the gun being cocked reached Elijah's ears, and for a moment he thought about his options. The old instincts kicked in. He could fight. He could run. But what if there was a way to end this, once and for all? "Who do you work for?" Elijah asked, his voice steady. He didn't need to see the man to know he was close. He could feel the presence of someone who had been in his life before, a shadow from his past that had never truly let him go. The voice, the power in his words, it was all so familiar. Elijah could practically taste the betrayal. "Who sent you?" A pause. Then the voice finally spoke, this time with a dark chuckle. "It doesn't matter. You'll never know. You've been a thorn in their side for too long, and now you're just a problem that needs to be taken care of. I'm just the one who's been chosen to do it." Elijah's thoughts raced. A second car, the sudden attack, the staged fight, everything had been part of a bigger plan. But the deeper mystery, the identity of those behind it all, was still just out of reach. Suddenly, the gunshot rang out, but it wasn't aimed at Elijah. The sound was different this time, too loud, too sharp, and it reverberated through his body, sending a shock of adrenaline straight to his heart. Before Elijah could react, the man who had been standing behind him collapsed to the ground, a bullet hole in his chest. Blood pooled around him as his body went limp. Elijah's breath caught in his throat as the chaos suddenly shifted. Someone else had fired. Someone who had been watching, waiting for the right moment to strike. A shadow stepped out from the corner of the alley, moving with ease, as if they had been here all along. Elijah could hear the faint click of a handgun being holstered. "You've been busy," a voice said, and it was one Elijah knew all too well. "Whoa." Elijah's voice faltered as he tried to comprehend the sudden twist in the plot. The figure stepped forward, and Elijah's heart skipped a beat when he recognized the face. It was someone he had never expected to see again, someone who had been part of his past, but not in the way he had thought. The person responsible for all of this, the one who had orchestrated the attacks, wasn't an enemy at all. It was someone he had trusted. Surprised, the figure smiled, their eyes dark with secrets. "It was never about you, Cain. It was always about the bigger game. And now I'm taking you down for good." The shock hit Elijah like a wave. The past had been leading to this moment, and he had been blind to it all along, until now. But the truth was clear. Elijah had been playing a game far beyond his understanding, and the most dangerous part, the game had only just begun. The tension in the air was thick. Elijah knew this wasn't over. He had been caught in a web of lies and betrayal, and now his survival depended on making one last move. The storm was far from finished. In fact, it was only escalating. The final twist had just been revealed, and the stakes had never been higher. But this time, Elijah was ready. Elijah stood frozen, his mind struggling to process the revelation. The figure in front of him wasn't just a stranger or an enemy from his past. This was someone he had trusted, someone who had once been part of his team, part of the very fabric of his life. The person who had just revealed themselves as the mastermind behind everything. His breath caught in his throat as the weight of the situation sank in. The betrayal was palpable, like a heavy weight pressing down on his chest. He blinked, trying to steady himself, his body tensing as he processed the shock of it all. How could this person he had once called a friend, be the one to set everything in motion? The attacks, the ambushes, the chaos, all of it had been carefully planned from the very beginning, and the final revelation was just the tip of the iceberg. "You," Elijah finally managed to say, his voice a mixture of disbelief and anger. "You're the one behind all of this." The person in front of him nodded slowly, their smile cold and unrepentant. "It was never about you, Cain. You were just a pawn in a much larger game. You were always a means to an end, nothing more." Elijah's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. This was a game of manipulation, of power, and of control. He had thought his past was behind him, that he had earned the right to live in peace, to walk away from the chaos he had left behind when he retired. But this person, this old ally, had been quietly watching from the shadows, biding their time until the perfect moment to strike. And now, the pieces of his life were all coming together in a way that left him feeling more like a pawn than ever. "You think you can just pull the strings and control everything." Elijah's voice was steady now, his anger giving way to resolve. "You think you can just use me as a tool to get what you want?" The figure chuckled, a low, almost pitying sound. "You still don't get it, do you? You were never meant to understand. You were always just a means to an end. This whole thing, this entire game, was never about you, Cain. It was about power. It was about taking control of something bigger than both of us." Elijah felt a pang of realization. This wasn't just some personal vendetta. This wasn't about revenge or some petty score to settle. This was about something far more dangerous, about using him, manipulating him, to get control of something far more valuable. The conspiracy he had walked into was much deeper than he had imagined, and it had been brewing in the shadows for far longer than he could have ever anticipated. For a moment, Elijah didn't know what to do. The shock of it all was almost too much to bear. His past, the things he had done, had all been for a purpose that had never been revealed to him. Now, standing here, face to face with the one person he had trusted, he realized that his every move had been orchestrated by someone else. But then the fire inside him reignited. He couldn't let this person have the last word. He couldn't let this be the end. "You really think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but dripping with menace. The figure raised an eyebrow, clearly underestimating Elijah's resolve. "You don't have a choice. You're too far in now. You don't have the resources, the connections, or the power to stop me. This is over." Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline. His body was still worn from the fight earlier, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had been in situations like this before, times when everything seemed lost, when the odds seemed insurmountable. But he had always found a way to fight back. This time would be no different. Without warning, Elijah lunged at the figure, his body moving with a speed and precision that came from years of experience. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a brutal, practiced move. The surprise on the figure's face was palpable as he struggled to free himself. But Elijah wasn't done. He grabbed the man's collar and yanked him upward, bringing their faces close. "You may have been pulling the strings," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "But I'm the one who's still standing. I'm the one who's going to make sure you pay for everything you've done." The figure's smug smile faltered as he realized the tables had turned. But even then, there was a hint of arrogance in his eyes. "You think you can stop me? You're out of your depth, Cain." Elijah's grip tightened, his anger flaring as he saw the extent of the man's betrayal. He couldn't let this person walk away, couldn't let him continue his plans. Everything Elijah had worked for, his survival, his peace, his future, depended on putting an end to this. The sound of sirens in the distance reached his ears. He could hear the wail of the approaching police vehicles, their presence a reminder that time was running out. But Elijah didn't care about the police. He cared about one thing now: stopping this man from hurting anyone else. The rest didn't matter. "You don't get to win," Elijah said, his voice a whisper of determination. With one final swift motion, Elijah disarmed the figure, forcing him to his knees. The man's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as Elijah restrained him, his breath ragged with exertion. By the time the police arrived, Elijah had already done what needed to be done. They took the man into custody, but not before he'd muttered something that would stay with Elijah forever. "You don't know what you've just done," the man said, his voice dripping with contempt. "You think you've won? This is just the beginning. There's more, so much more." But Elijah didn't care. He had faced down his past, and he had won. The truth had been uncovered, the conspiracy had been dismantled, and the pieces of his life, his real life, were finally starting to fall into place. As the police led the man away, Elijah turned his back, walking into the darkness of the night, the weight of the past finally lifting from his shoulders. The storm had passed. The battle was over. Elijah knew that the world was still full of shadows, full of threats that would always be lurking in the background. But for now, he had his peace. For now, he had won. As he walked away, the city lights flickering in the distance, Elijah couldn't help but reflect on everything that had happened. The betrayal, the fights, the twists and turns. It had all been a test of who he really was. And he had passed. The past would always be with him, but it didn't define him anymore. He had survived, and that was what mattered. The end of one chapter, but the beginning of something new. And Elijah Cain was ready. The person in front of him nodded slowly, their smile cold and unrepentant. "It was never about you, Cain. You were just a pawn in a much larger game. You were always a means to an end, nothing more." Elijah's mind raced as he tried to piece everything together. This was a game of manipulation, of power, and of control. He had thought his past was behind him, that he had earned the right to live in peace, to walk away from the chaos he had left behind when he retired. But this person, this old ally, had been quietly watching from the shadows, biding their time until the perfect moment to strike. And now, the pieces of his life were all coming together in a way that left him feeling more like a pawn than ever. "You think you can just pull the strings and control everything." Elijah's voice was steady now, his anger giving way to resolve. "You think you can just use me as a tool to get what you want." The figure chuckled, a low, almost pitying sound. "You still don't get it, do you? You were never meant to understand. You were always just a means to an end. This whole thing, this entire game, was never about you, Cain. It was about power. It was about taking control of something bigger than both of us." Elijah felt a pang of realization. This wasn't just some personal vendetta. This wasn't about revenge or some petty score to settle. This was about something far more dangerous, about using him, manipulating him, to get control of something far more valuable. The conspiracy he had walked into was much deeper than he had imagined, and it had been brewing in the shadows for far longer than he could have ever anticipated. For a moment, Elijah didn't know what to do. The shock of it all was almost too much to bear. His past, the things he had done, had all been for a purpose that had never been revealed to him. Now, standing here, face to face with the one person he had trusted, he realized that his every move had been orchestrated by someone else. But then the fire inside him reignited. He couldn't let this person have the last word. He couldn't let this be the end. "You really think I'm just going to let you get away with this?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but dripping with menace. The figure raised an eyebrow, clearly underestimating Elijah's resolve. "You don't have a choice. You're too far in now. You don't have the resources, the connections, or the power to stop me. This is over." Elijah felt a surge of adrenaline. His body was still worn from the fight earlier, but his mind was sharper than ever. He had been in situations like this before, times when everything seemed lost, when the odds seemed insurmountable. But he had always found a way to fight back. This time would be no different. Without warning, Elijah lunged at the figure, his body moving with a speed and precision that came from years of experience. He grabbed the man's arm and twisted it behind his back, forcing him to the ground with a brutal, practiced move. The surprise on the figure's face was palpable as he struggled to free himself. But Elijah wasn't done. He grabbed the man's collar and yanked him upward, bringing their faces close. "You may have been pulling the strings," Elijah said, his voice low and dangerous. "But I'm the one who's still standing. I'm the one who's going to make sure you pay for everything you've done." The figure's smug smile faltered as he realized the tables had turned. But even then, there was a hint of arrogance in his eyes. "You think you can stop me? You're out of your depth, Cain." Elijah's grip tightened, his anger flaring as he saw the extent of the man's betrayal. He couldn't let this person walk away, couldn't let him continue his plans. Everything Elijah had worked for, his survival, his peace, his future, depended on putting an end to this. The sound of sirens in the distance reached his ears. He could hear the wail of the approaching police vehicles, their presence a reminder that time was running out. But Elijah didn't care about the police. He cared about one thing now: stopping this man from hurting anyone else. The rest didn't matter. "You don't get to win," Elijah said, his voice a whisper of determination. With one final swift motion, Elijah disarmed the figure, forcing him to his knees. The man's eyes widened in shock and disbelief as Elijah restrained him, his breath ragged with exertion.